In this demo video, we're going to see how to use the MgroDB API to push data through the Workspaces programmatically instead of going through the web interface. To make this easier, I'm going to use the mgrowth control package that you can install using pip. This is a sister project to MgroDB. It can automatically download data from MgroDB experiments, or you can load the data locally and you can push it through Workspaces. Both of these projects are independent. You can use them you don't need one in order to use the other. But this will make the demonstration a little bit easier. I'm going to use this example file to demonstrate how to push data to MgroDB. First, I'm going to load the experimental data. I'm going to use the data loader from mgrowth control utils. This class can be instantiated without any parameters. By default, it's going to make requests to the MgroDB website. But as you can see here, I've provided a root URL, which is my local computer, where I'm running a local instance of the database. This is going to make things a little bit easier for me to push data without touching the production deployment. You'll also see that I have an API key here. The API key is used for pushing purposes. You do not need it if you're only downloading data and using it for your own purposes. In this case, adding an API key allows me to actually modify the website to actually push the data to the website. This API key can be found from the profile page right over here. If you go to your profile page, the info tab is going to have an API key section. As you can see, it's hidden. You can copy it and paste it somewhere without actually showing it. It's a good idea not to show it anywhere, because if anybody has it, they can push data to your Workspaces. In this case, as I said, this is my local computer, so it doesn't actually matter if I show it to you. And in this case, I'm just going to copy this key. Yeah, and as you can see, this key is already here. What I could do now is I can load the data from a remote experiment. For example, this one. This is the public identifier of the experiment. And by doing this, the data is going to be pushed into the data loader, and I'm going to be able to access its individual data traces, its naming, metadata, and stuff like this. However, in this case, I'm going to use, in this case, why download the data if it's already present there? Let's instead load a local example file, and using the load local data function. And this particular example file looks like this. There is a BT counts column, which is the consumer, the microbial growth in cells per microliter. There's a time column right here, the first column, and there are metabolite columns, acetate, format, and so on. And we can load this local data. In order to for the data loader to know which parts of the data are consumers and which part are substrates, we need an X selector and possibly an S selector. In this case, we're just going to say that the X selector, which is a regex, is the column BT counts. Note that I'm adding a $sign at the end to anchor this column to the end. This doesn't matter for this particular data set. It will matter for the next one I'm going to demonstrate. And we can ignore this selector for now. So this is the simplest thing we can do here. We can take this example file, tell it how to determine what an X value is, or a consumer. And then if we want, we can print data.names in order to observe what has been loaded, like how the columns have been detected. I'm going to do this by using uv run python push test. So this is the name of the file. If I now run this, this data is going to be loaded, and it will take a little bit of time initially because of UV loading the libraries. But you can see now we have a model names object that determines that the X column is BT counts and the S columns are all of these metabolite columns. You can also see there are error columns, which in this particular data set are empty. So we can validate that we are detecting correctly the metadata that we expect. At this point, what we can do is we can fit a consumer resource model First, we need to extract certain parameters. There is a shorthand method that we can use from single species data. In this case, we just have a single species, which is why there is a way to easily extract sensible parameters. For a more complicated example, you should take a look at the documentation and read it carefully to understand the parameters and how to tune them. And we can call the fit function, which by default uses least squares fitting, to fit the observed data in terms of substrates and consumers, to fit a model to it and be able to predict the data for 200 data points from the start time of the data to the end time of the data. We can then use the push remote data function to push it to MQDB. The workspace name by default is default, so we could skip this if we wanted to. In this case, I'm going to use the workspace API test. This workspace does not currently exist. We can take a look at our workspaces to see that there's a default workspace here, and that's it. And by adding this name here, this workspace is going to be created. We can pass the simulated data, or we could not. We can pass X units and S units. Again, this is optional. If we don't pass units, this metadata will simply not be passed along, and we'll still be able to plot the data. It's just that knowing what the units are is going to allow comparing it with data on the actual website. Finally, we can print what comes out from the response. The response contains several parameters. One of them is the URL we can use to visualize our data. I'm now going to run this, and this is going to take a little bit of time as well because, again, the fitting process is going to take a second. And once this is done, we can take this URL and we can paste it here. And now, as you can see, we are in the Workspaces section in the API test workspace, and we have a number of data traces. We have BT counts, which is a column that we saw in the CSV, and we also have a simulation of the BT counts, which came from the sim object. We can use autoscale here to visualize it properly, and we can also take a look at the acetate values, for example. Although now we can see that the measurements are in cells per milliliter because this is a default unit that is converted to, that the units are converted to. And the measurements in millimolars, we can put them on the right hand side to be able to visualize them better, and maybe auto scale here. We can see that these are the observed data points, and this is the model prediction. If we now wanted to update our script, for example, I'm going to use a different data set here. This is a data set that has the same data, however, it also has SCD columns here for each of these values. So BT count, SCD, and then for acetate, there is also an acetate SCD column. And in this case, in order to detect these error columns correctly, I add an error selector, which looks for the string space STD and replaces it with nothing. What this means essentially is for each of the columns, if it looks like a standard deviation column, or it looks like an error column, whatever that means for our dataset, we need to return the column that it refers to. So once again, we can print data.names in order to observe what gets parsed, whether it gets parsed correctly. I can do this like so, and we can see that the model names now have an X value for BT counts, S values just like before, but now there's an error value, which is BT count STD, and S error values for acetate format and so on. And you can see that the first value here, acetate STD, corresponds to the first column, acetate. If we were to make a mistake here, one problem, for example, is what if I put an X selector here and so, removed the $sign at the end and said, well, an X column is anything that includes the string BT counts. In that case, things will not be detected correctly because you'll see that now both BT counts and BT counts STD is detected as an error column, and this confuses the parsing process a little bit. So we should try to be careful about how we select the columns. Note that if you use the remote loading function, So data remote load remote experiment. This function automatically determines the metadata determines what is a substrate and what is a consumer based on the metadata that comes from mgrowth-db. But this is a useful example to see, I think, because you might have a data set that does not come from mgrowth-db, of course. So in this case, I'm going to keep everything as it is. Bear in mind, this is a very small change, of course, but a different change might be a change in our predictions, a change in the parameterization here, a different fitting process, or really anything. Now, if I run the push test, once again, it's going to take a little bit of time for the fitting process to go through. However, now that it's done, we can simply refresh this URL and we'll see that now we have the same predictions really, but now we have error bars right here on the data. We might have to move the measurements again, but the error bars also on the acetate values. So this is a small change again, but it just demonstrates what you can do in terms of a workflow. You write a script or a Jupyter notebook or whatever it is that that is convenient to you. You make changes to it, you adapt it, and then at the end you can push the data to mgrowth-db, and then you can use the web interface to explore it and possibly compare it with other studies that are uploaded, or compare it with data that you have uploaded directly here. You can see that the API data is in a separate section. It always gets overwritten, it always gets reloaded once you do a push. But you can also have a direct upload section and just upload this data through a CSV, for example. And you do not have to use mgrowth control. You can read the API documentation of mgrowth-db to learn how to use the API manually, directly. It boils down to sending and receiving JSON packages of metadata, and also receiving CSV data for the raw measurement data, as you can see. But you would have to read this in more detail, and likewise you can use mgrowth control outside of mgrowth-db. You can read up on the data loading section to understand how they integrate, but you can also go through the other tutorials and model documentation to learn how to fit your particular data set, how to adapt your parameters to whatever it is that you need. That's it for this tutorial. If something is still unclear, bear in mind that there is help documentation both about workspaces and about everything else on mgrowth-db, and in many cases you will see contextual information that you might be able to click on, read more on, to get to the full documentation page in the help files.